Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. Capcom have quite the storied history when it comes to cross-pollinating their games with characters from other franchises. It almost seems like much of the Capcom universe is interconnected when you consider franchises such as Final Fight, Saturday Night Slam Masters, Street Fighter, and others have all shared intellectual properties at one time or another. Today we are going to be taking a look at the often overlooked backstory of one of the most interesting examples of Capcom's mix and match policy, as we take a deep dive into the history and archives of the pink-haired, scantily clad, whip-cracking minx herself, the one they call Poison. Yeah! Designed by Akira Yasuda way back in the 1980s, Poison's look was based on an amalgamation of things, including images that he had seen when browsing Western magazines. In terms of a more direct influence though, the character's inspiration comes from a rather surprising source: the gorgeous ladies of wrestling, aka the all-women's promotion abbreviated as GLOW. While GLOW today is more famous through its fictionalised retelling on Netflix, the original GLOW would spawn athletes such as WWE's Ivory and Poison's inspiration Hollywood, who was portrayed by none other than Jean Basson. If this woman looks familiar to you, that is because she is, as she would also play Jane in the infamous video game Plumbers Don't Wear Ties. This woman got around. Yasuda is said to have seen Basson in the inaugural issue of the GLOW magazine after it hit shelves in Japan, and used her as the foundation for which he would later design Poison. On a side note, I have an entire in-depth video covering Basson's strange video game and wrestling career, so why not check that one out later? As for Poison, she would originally appear alongside her palette swap pal Roxy in Capcom's triumphant 1989 arcade beat-em-up classic known as Final Fight, rather than debut in a blaze of glory like a Blaze. Poison's rather inauspicious debut was as a non-playable baddie, working for the game's antagonist organisation known as the Mad Gear Gang. Raised in an orphanage in Los Angeles with best friend and fellow orphan Roxy, Poison joined Mad Gear when the two of them fled Los Angeles for the beautiful pixelated skyline of Metro City. She knew that being a part of Mad Gear would ensure that she stayed out of prison, and her love of fighting, combined with her athletic skills and flamboyant wardrobe, made her an ideal fit for the strangely fashion-conscious gang. Speaking of this character, it would be impossible to mention her without bringing up the controversial elephant in the room. There has been a lot of controversy, confusion, and quite frankly, misinformation over the years regarding Poison's gender, particularly with regards to her appearance in the first Final Fight. The originally released Japanese instruction booklet for the game refers to her as the localised term Niwolf, which apparently is a translation of a Japanese slang term for trans woman. However, some cite that the term is a little more offensive than that. Taking into account that this happened all the way back in the 80s, some feared that this kind of content would have been too controversial for Western audiences of the time, so both Poison and her old mate Roxy were replaced by male thugs named Billy and Sid. Despite Yasuda's protest, William and Sydney remained as the permanent replacements for Poison and Roxy on all subsequent Western Nintendo releases of Final Fight and its many ports, much to the chagrin of purist fans of the original game. Further to this, many sources erroneously claim that Poison and Roxy were originally intended to be biologically female, but were changed to transgender characters in order to attempt to appease Western audiences that would have protested against male-on-female violence. However, the original concept art shows this was not the case, as the term Niwolf had been attached to Roxy and Poison since their very first inception. Final Fight's director Akira Nishitani stated in 2007 that it was up to the player to decide whether they believed Poison and Roxy to be male or female, but later clarified his position during a discussion on Twitter, in which he stated that in his view, Poison is indeed a woman. However, adding to the debate even further, at Comic-Con 2011, Capcom Senior Vice President Christian Svensson stated that Poison's gender is intended to be ambiguous, thus making her gender a point for discussion amongst gaming historians right up until this day. Putting all of this to one side, Poison's original design in Final Fight was intended to contrast the larger, brutish, Hulk-like thugs that populated the lion's share of the game, and her movement was programmed to be somewhat random and unpredictable, making her a formidable and often frustrating foe to contend with. Not quite attaining the upper mid-card and occasional main event status she eventually rose to, she is unfortunately a bit of a jobber in her original appearance, due to the fact that she functions as no more than a minor recurring enemy, albeit a somewhat tricky one. Poison shows up sporadically over the 6 stages, or rounds as they call them here. As far as consistent storytelling goes, I'm not quite sure how that works with the canon of the character, as not only does our girl rise from the dead multiple times, we also on occasion encounter multiple poisons at once. Perhaps there's a load of poison imposters chipping about in Metro City. Or perhaps she is some sort of shape-shifting, multiplying zombie in the game. Who knows? Once again, this is a question that raises a lot of ambiguity. Yeah, I got it that time. What we do know is that Poison's next appearance would be in chibi form in the 1993 NES spin-off game titled Mighty Final Fight. Characterised as her little sister, a super deformed version of our girl shows up sporadically through the game as a recurring enemy, much like she does in the regular sized head version of Final Fight. Generally fairly well received by critics at the time, Mighty Final Fight served as a way to allow poor impoverished NES owners the chance to play a version of Final Fight. To its credit, the game did have newly added experience points feature, loosely giving the game something of a vague RPG feel, so it had its fair share of uniqueness going for it. Our scantily clad heroine's next appearance would be as a non-playable character in 1997 Street Fighter III Second Impact, which was an update of Capcom's original Street Fighter III arcade game New Generation, which had come out earlier that same year. Moving on from the evil Maggie gang, she was now transitioning into the possibly even more evil role of professional wrestling manager, as she often accompanies the enormous Hugo into battle. Based on the recurring Andor character from Final Fight, who was in turn based partly on the legendary French professional wrestler Andre the Giant, Hugo is in search of a tag team partner for an upcoming tag team tournament, and believes the best place to look for such a partner is amongst the ragtag bunch of misfits found in the Street Fighter III game. In the next game in the Street Fighter III timeline, Third Strike, Hugo returns with Poison once again in the manager role. This time Hugo is worried that there is no more competition for him after going through his tag tournament with such ease. As no one will dare challenge him anymore, he and Poison are hoping to become the next Vince and Linda McMahon as they look to recruit fighters for their own wrestling federation. In Hugo's ending, we see that they've been successful in their endeavour and have formed the hilariously named HWA, or Huge Wrestling Army, featuring a roster full of many of the Third Strike characters. Huge Wrestling Army might not sound like something from real life, but bear in mind there was a genuine company in Japan called Wrestle and Romance, I guess because Japan. Poison would next show up in the rather poorly received 1999 3D arcade fighter Final Fight Revenge alongside 9 other Metro City residents, and would mark her first appearance ever as a playable character. Bloody finally! Developed for the Sega Titan video arcade board, which shared many properties with the Saturn, the following year would see Capcom port the game to Sega's ill-fated 32-bit powerhouse exclusively to Japanese audiences to muted responses. This would actually end up being Capcom's last game for the Saturn, which seems an unfortunate way to go out, given just how many classic games and fantastic ports they put out on the system. The end of a glorious partnership indeed. Poison uses many of the gymnastic type attacks that we associate with her, as well as making excellent use of her new whip for both stealing weapons from enemies and powerful range attacks. She has a Poison Kiss special move, which if connected shows a brief peep show on screen of Poison in various rude poses, which makes opponents go into a dazed state. If this saucy special move causes the winning blow, Poison's victory screen sees her performing a pole dance with her whip, acting as the makeshift pole. In addition, Poison can lob her handcuffs upwards to immobilise opponents, as well as perform a Ryu-esque fireball and dragon punch style jumping uppercut. Poison's ending reminds us of her devious side, as it is revealed she framed Cody for the crimes she and her pals committed and has sent him to jail. The poor bugger. Needless to say though, Cody would bounce back, but you can learn more about that in my History of Cody video, which is also on this channel. Cheeky plug. Next up for Poison would be another playable appearance in 2012's 7th generation crossover fighting classic Street Fighter Cross Tekken, in which she would be reunited with her old ally Hugo, but this time as his official tag partner. armed with many of the same quick, athletic maneuvers from Final Fight Revenge, but this time with her whip being replaced by a riding crop. Poison speed and super rapid combos make her an ideal partner to contrast and complement Hugo's gargantuan power and size. Going back to her original 80s glow-inspired concept, the influence pro wrestling has had on Poison is also evident in her moveset, as it has been expanded to include various Frankensteiner-style head scissors, along with many other attacks that wouldn't look out of place in a WWE ring. Her and Hugo's ending sees them bring back the previously mentioned HWA wrestling promotion, when they realised that the Pandora's box thingy they had been fighting for in the story wasn't going to bring them the fame and fortune that they desired. Let's hope they have more success then when Vince brings the XFL back yet again, eh? 2014 would be an important year for our villainess, as she would finally make her debut as a playable fighter as part of the Street Fighter roster. The Deviant Criminal would be added to the lineup in Ultra Street Fighter 4, which was a later edition of the game. Arriving on the scene for more violent and slightly suggestive mayhem, in this game she is sporting a very similar look and moveset to a Street Fighter Cross Tekken iteration, albeit with slightly altered speed and general movements to fit with the pace and mechanics of the game. Poison is this time fighting solo. Disenfranchised with the life of a wrestling promoter and disappointed with the talent at her disposal, she enters the new Street Fighter 4 tournament by chance and decides to enter to both test her combat skills and scout new fighters for a promotion once more. Poison's ending shows her do a complete U-turn on this though, as she inexplicably gets all of the fighters she has recruited to form a somewhat Kiss-inspired rock band because Capcom, I guess. When asked why she made this strange and unexpected move, Poison herself states music and martial arts are the perfect tag team. Completely sensible storytelling. As you all know, it would not be long past this point that fans would be treated to Street Fighter V. By this point in time, now somewhat of a fan favourite, Poison would be eventually back by popular demand for the 4th season of additional character DLC that would be added to the game's base roster. Not made available until the day before Valentine's Day 2020, almost 4 years after the game's original release, Poison would return with a new look, shorter hair, multiple alternate costumes, and her dangerous and iconic whip. Her V-trigger attacks give her access to multiple Molotov cocktails, as well as a range-busting whip swing attack that can also be very handy for chaining combos together. Due to the more narrative-based structure of the story modes of Street Fighter V when compared to the classic arcade modes of previous games, we get a more involved tale, giving us a far more detailed in-game Poison adventure than we'd ever had before. Firstly, we see her briefly reunite with her old Bezzy-mate Roxy before continuing on her quest to recruit the best fighters she can possibly find for her wrestling organisation. Not quite sure what happened to the idea of being a rock star, but everyone is entitled to change their minds, I guess. In the game, she makes a failed attempt to recruit the enormous Abigail before turning her attention to Cody, who turns her down in favour of his new job as Metro City Mayor, bringing both his and her arc full circle. Further to this, she even forms a partnership with Hugo, the very partnership we would later see in Street Fighter 3, that occurs chronologically in the Street Fighter franchise's timeline at a later date. Poison's late entry in the Street Fighter V tournament marks her last real-world in-game appearance to date, but she was scheduled to appear in both Final Fight Streetwise and the ill-fated Capcom Fighting All-Stars game. Despite being seen in the promotional comic book that came out prior to Final Fight Streetwise's release, Poison was cut from the game for unknown reasons. A 2006 3D beat-em-up released for the PlayStation 2 and the original Xbox, the game served as a sequel to Final Fight 3. But the GTA 3 inspired gritty mess was roundly panned by critics, so it's probably for the best that she didn't sully her good name by being associated with this tripe. As for the Capcom Fighting All-Stars, the planned 3D fighting game featuring crossover characters from several of Capcom's biggest franchises, she was scheduled to appear in this one too. Unfortunately, due to extremely poor feedback from beta testing in mid-2003, the game was swiftly cancelled in August of that year. It's unclear exactly how close to the finished product director Toyohisa Tanabe had got, but there does exist some footage online of the game, so we can have a little look for ourselves at what might have been. For all of this, I hope this has helped build a better picture around the at points controversial Poison character, and did an adequate job of demonstrating that over the years how she has risen from a recurring 2D NPC enemy sprite to a fully fleshed out 3D polygonal Street Fighter roster member, who has even been paired with her own backstory. Poison's rise to prominence is an interesting one, and I cannot wait to see what's next for this character in the not too distant future. Personally, I would adore a new side-scrolling Final Fight beat-em-up. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was the controversial story of Poison. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like it, comment, hit that subscriber button and ring that notification bell to ensure that you see my future uploads. I have uploaded plenty of videos in the past covering Street Fighter lore and many individual characters who have appeared throughout the series' history. Something I like to do at the end of these videos is answer different questions from my Patreon backers. And today I have an excellent question from 2D Forever, which is perfectly in line with today's content. And he says, is lore important in fighting games? Which I think is a brilliant thing to bring up, really. Personally, I do not feel the lore is important to the actual gameplay experience itself, but what I find most interesting about the lore of Street Fighter, for example, is how deep it goes despite the fact that it's not actually needed. You see, many people go for years and years playing various fighting games, such as Street Fighter 2 for example, and there is so little story included within that actual game that it allows gamers to pretty much use their imagination and form their own stories around said characters. So it's really interesting to do a little digging or even watch my videos and find out how much depth and how much of a universe has been built around each one. Like the fact that you can pick Cody as an example, who we briefly mentioned in this video, and he appeared in Final Fight back in 1989, and then he became imprisoned for a bit, and then became a criminal, and then he became a mayor past that point. To me, that's very interesting. It's a lot of story where you wouldn't necessarily expect it to be. So I don't think you need lore in fighting games, but it's a lovely touch. What's great to look into. Yeah. Cheerio.